Hey guys, it's Nikki. I'm here for my second book of the month for the virtual book club. It is called Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. I'll show you the book right here. It's a good book. I'm really excited to do the review for it. I really enjoyed it. And I will also call out here, there will be spoilers in this review. As I said with the last book of the month review, I will be going about this as if it's a book club. So I will be assuming that you have read the book when I'm doing the review. So if you have not read it and don't want to be spoiled, click off the video now. The general summary for this book is that it's a post-apocalyptic thriller, because it does include a zombie plague, and the sci-fi part for me just comes from the use of cordyceps, which I loved. The biologist, my inner biologist, just danced with delight when I got to that. And it also uses multiple perspectives, which if you watched last month's, you'll know I actually quite enjoy. So to start, the book starts with Melanie. She's this small child, and just kind of as she stumbles through her thoughts for the day, you learn that she's in a cell, except for when she goes to classes or showers. All of the kids that are in her class are also in these other cells. She tells us that there's about 38 cells, I think, in total. And they have these daily classes with different teachers during the week. From everything she's experienced, she also lets you know that they're on a military base called Hotel Echo, and that the people in the base fear the hungries, thus the kids do as well. Also, although it's not outright stated, based on what Melanie thinks and what she tells you about the other kids, you kind of understand that the kids that were collected and are being held in these cells are odd in some way. Like, they're very obviously being studied. I really enjoyed the story. A lot of it's from Melanie's perspective, which is really nice, having it from the perspective of this child. But it's also from three other perspectives. It starts on an army base, post-fall of modern civilization. It starts by showing the daily routines of all the characters involved, and then it shows small changes into the routines that slowly seem to spiral out of control. And that's kind of the gist of the story, is the characters responding to each event as it's happening, and this loss of control over the situation that seemed so sterile and well-maintained in the beginning. So that's just a summary of the book. I'll move on now to my likes and dislikes. Didn't really have any dislikes in this one. I actually really enjoyed a lot of the book, and I will let you know now. I will spend a lot of time on the science behind what's going on, because it was the most interesting aspect for me. So to start off, I really enjoyed multiple perspectives. I'm really a sucker for multiple perspectives. I really like it as a tool to move the story forward, especially when it allows characters to kind of be fleshed out, both using their own thoughts, their interactions with others, and then how others are observing them. I find it just a really effective tool for creating a very dynamic character. I like how they have this set up. You have the two warm characters. You have Melanie, who's kind of warm and innocent and intelligent. And then that also in that category, you would have Helen Justineau, who is warm and intelligent, but she almost has more of a manipulative aspect to her character as well, which comes out later in the book. And then you have like the cold characters. Eddie Parks, who's kind of cold, guarded, pragmatic, just kind of what you would see as your typical military man. And then you also have Carolyn Caldwell, and she's cold, calculating, and with like a smidge of unscrupulousness in here. I really like that, even though there's these two categories, like warm and cold, it helps flesh out the other characters just by analyzing how they see other people letting emotion or logic control their actions and their thoughts. And because the characters are diverse in other ways, Melanie, a child, Helen Justineau is a teacher and child psychologist, Eddie Parks is, like I said, a military man, and then Carolyn Caldwell is a biologist. And like I said, they play off each other really well, and having the difference between that warmth and cold and the logic and emotion really helps flesh the characters out as they move forward. And I also really like how the story is kind of like a Pandora's box situation, and it's actually talked about in the back of the edition of this book that I have. There's a small interview with M.R. Carey, and they do talk about the relation to Pandora's box there. And I just really like it because it plays out very interestingly. Melanie is kind of Pandora, and her interactions with the others, and the situation and how advanced the situation is when they kind of realize how screwed they are, is really where the Pandora's part plays in, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Here is the next part I liked, and it's the science of the situation. Just so you know, I get really ranty. I just get really excited about it, and I start talking, and I turn into like that clip you've seen from Sunny in Philadelphia where he has this like big, huge connected wall and crazy sleepless eyes, and he's just like gesturing like mad. That's the guy I kind of feel like when I talk about the science of this book. The use of I think it was Ophiocordyceps, it was perfect. They did a pretty good job of explaining what was going on in layman's terms, just in terms of the fungal life cycle. The doctor harping kind of on the asexual versus sexual parts of the fungal life cycle, and the lack of mutation without the sexual reproduction, and kind of how that's affecting how everything's moving, and also just the fact that they use this Ophiocordyceps. There are species of cordyceps fungus that are found in other things. It's even mentioned in the video game The Last of Us. And it's really interesting because the general kind of idea of this fungus is that it'll infiltrate a creature usually kind of take over it'll usually take over the central nervous system of the bug. In this case, ants is the one I'm talking about, to do what they want. And it'll try to get them to get back to the colony so the fungus can continue to propagate. But the important thing here is that it does take over the central nervous system, and it does end up controlling them by adjusting the neurotransmitters that are given, and that adjusts the actions of the animal. In this book, as you go on, I like that you kind of have it split into the two groups. I call them the Hungries version 1.0 and the Hungries version 2.0. So with the Hungry versus 1.0, these are kind of the original infected from a primary source. So they were either infected because of someone else who was infected, either bit them, and the Hungries 2.0 are kind of these kids, specifically that you find out that they're the kids that were in the cell on this army base, and they're infected too, but they're not reacting to infection the same way. So with them, it's kind of like, how did the cordyceps manage? How's it managing to affect these two groups differently? And the one thing I really liked about Carolyn Caldwell is that she was very analytical about this, and at times that means certain ethics were kind of thrown out the window for her because she viewed everything as part of the experiment. After she kind of finds out what's going on, her theory is that first version infected Hungries somehow allowed for vertical transmission of the fungus. Her theory is that because the fungus affects different places of the brain differently in the originally infected people, that it may allow for some of them to be able to reproduce if the sex organs are not completely taken over as well. And that's how she thinks these second generation Hungries are created. The vertical transmission is initiated just by having the fungus be able to get through the blood-brain barrier, get through the barriers in terms of getting into the fertilized egg, or if the fungus gets in after the fetus has begun developing, and then the fungus and the fetus develop in utero in unison, which would explain the difference between people who are primarily infected and the people who are infected via vertical transmission. I loved the end of the book where she was talking about it so in depth. It just tickled every little biologist part of me, and it kept me engaged the whole time because I was trying to figure out, along with her, how this was transmitted, how it crossed these different barriers that would typically be very hard, and how it propagated asexually across the population. And one thing that I did find kind of interesting is towards the end, where you find the ones that are kind of having the fruiting bodies develop out of them, kind of in a very similar way to the aliens and aliens popping out of the bodies of their victims. Moving on, I'm going to talk briefly about the Ophiocordyceps, and I liked how it was set up. I had mentioned before, it had the two different ways of interacting with the brain. The sledgehammer way, which you got with the first ones, where a lot of the higher functions of the brain were cut out, so your decision making and critical thinking and a lot of the base needs were still activated. So even though you don't necessarily breathe, they still had the hunger and apparent sex drive, and some of the other things that were emotional that also, and some of the things that just allowed for life sustainment. And I just really liked that how she talked about how it was a train going through or a sledgehammer going through, and how because the brain didn't develop with it, it really just went through the brain and just annihilated everything that kind of would have been important. But it did it in such a way that it didn't completely destroy the host, which is a good for the parasite. And then you also get to where she talks about how it's more integrated in the second generation because the brain kind of develops around the fungus, and that allows the fungus to alter the neurotransmitters as the brain grows, allowing it to grow in the way that it needs in order to stay in life more effectively to allow propagation down the road. And then I'll move on to kind of the second generation of hungries that I want to talk about, which I really liked the idea of it. I'm not really sure how the fungus exactly works in terms of the second generation. I know it'll either stimulate neurotransmitter production, or it'll cause its own neurotransmitter production, which the fungus either can act as surrogate neurons and synapses, which allows for this different functioning. I'm not sure how it ended up with all of the kids ending up being geniuses, like if the ones that didn't survive this just died and these are the only ones that are left, kind of like the survival of the fittest thing. And Dr. Caldwell also talks about how their birth was likely to be non-traditional and non-vaginal. There's a very good chance that the child was cannibalistic and ate its way out of the mother. My question here is kind of how would it do this? Like what mutation would allow for this? Like is it the increase in the neurotransmitters, or does the fungus make its own that increases the level of neurotransmitters? And I didn't really get the answer to that, but I loved the way that the story differentiated between the two different generations and just included that vertical transmission. And honestly, I really liked the Ophiocordyceps in general. It was just this amazing fungus. It was so destructive in the first generation, yet so manipulative in the second generation. It was just, I really enjoyed watching the way that they talked about it working, the fact that it could cross the blood-brain barrier, the placenta. I loved that they had this long asexual period because it didn't need additional mutations to go to further itself. It had the mutation it needed to take over the best population of hosts that was necessary. And then after this long asexual period, once they do start fruiting, because it's been so long, there's just that extra element of terror in it, and I loved that as well. And because of these mutations, it so effectively bypassed the immune system in humans, and that was so terrifying, which is really interesting. And I thought it was a good fungus choice because they used a family of fungus that is known for stuff like this zombification of a population. My only real dislike here with this book is just part of Dr. Caldwell's character. I didn't really care for the way she talked about cordyceps, like it's sentient. Evolution really isn't a sentient thing. Adaptation isn't a sentient thing. It's a biological response to the environment. And it's just not a big thing. It just irritated me that she would talk about it as if she was the villain in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it just wasn't a sentient villain. And that kind of sums up my likes and dislikes of the book. There were a lot more likes than dislikes, especially just with the science aspect of this being so effective to me. And with that, I will move on to my characters. So there's kind of the 5 main characters in this book. You have Melanie, Helen Justineau, Eddie Parks, Kieran Gallagher, and Carolyn Caldwell. So to start with, I'll talk about Melanie. She's the one you spend the most time with. She's a child, I believe it's about 10 or so. She's very pragmatic, very logical. Her pragmaticism and logical thought progression play out very interestingly, kind of in the interaction post-army base. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with the fact that with the schooling that she received, logic was nurtured over emotion in class. And there's a lot of these kind of human interactions and general reading of social norms and social cues that the kids didn't get because of how the situation was set up. Melanie also has this very strong hero worship of Helen Justineau, which results in some interesting situations later on and a sense of responsibility on both her and Helen Justineau's part. As I mentioned earlier, one thing with Melanie is also she's kind of the representation of Pandora's box, or Pandora opening the box. her character sticks to the role of Pandora through the course of the book, and it allows for a very interesting ending because she's written to hold that role all the way through. Next, I'll get to Helen Justineau. She is an interesting balance of compassion and manipulation. A lot of it is related to her survival being important to herself. She does care for Melanie in some capacity. She actually straight out mentions that some of this is due to a child she killed post-fall, and so a lot of her actions towards Melanie are guilt-driven because of the death of this other child. And she is a child psychologist, which as a teacher put her in a role different from the other teachers, and it allows her to kind of more effectively interact with Melanie because even though Melanie's quite intelligent, she has a lot of the same mannerisms and questions that children typically have. Makes Helen deal with Melanie better than the other characters because she had more interactions with children. Next we get to Kieran Gallagher. He in and of himself is kind of a different psyche and different time than adults. He's one of that generation that was first born post-break. So society had fallen and they'd kind of gone into their little city-states almost. And so he's born after that. So there's a lot of things that the adults talk about that he's never experienced. He is a soldier, and in terms of that, he is very green. Eddie Parks, the sergeant, talks about how he doesn't have a lot of experience and not a lot of knowledge and wisdom in terms of army life. He's also innocent, but he's innocent in a different way than Melanie is innocent. Melanie has this childlike innocence, but she has a lot of pragmatism and that she gets as she uncovers things about herself. Kieran maintains this kind of innocence that comes from lack of knowledge of what life was like before the fall of modern civilization, and a lack of threat because until he became a soldier, he wasn't really exposed necessarily to the same threat level that these hungries posed. And between his greenness and this innocence, it does eventually result in his death, which is unfortunate, but he is kind of the least valuable character of the group. It had to happen to someone, might as well have been the young man. Next we get to Eddie Parks. He's a military lifer. I believe he was in the military pre-break, but he's also in the military post-break, and after the fall of civilization, he became what they called a snatcher, which is those are the people that were going out and finding these kind of like hungry children that had the higher functioning of normal humans. And eventually he became a guard to one of the bases that was holding these children. He would also qualify as a pragmatic survivalist. I would say this because he does, even though they do end up keeping Melanie in their group after they leave the army base against his better judgment, he does use Melanie strategically, and the strategic use is kind of how he justifies keeping her around, even though he does seem to be forming some kind of emotional attachment to her slowly. And that moves me on to Carolyn Caldwell, one of the crazy scientists, as I like to call her. The adjectives I would use for her are clinical, cold, calculating. I mean, you could use another C word that I'm not going to say here. Slightly more incredibly offensive. And she really sets herself apart because even though she does have emotion, she doesn't let it override her. She lets her work become her driver for life. And I mean, they do talk about it a little bit, so you understand she has this huge inferiority complex. She was on the short list for the scientists that they wanted to study this infection, but then she was just low enough that she missed the mark to go on to these two self-contained, like, Uber research facilities on wheels. And so she was relegated to Hotel Echo Army Base. And the other thing with Dr. Caldwell is she's a very good example of how a lot of the big leaps we've made in the science world come from when like ethics are stowed away. So a lot of the acts are considered unethical and unscrupulous, but you end up getting a lot of information out of it. I mean, that's happened previously in the past, especially if you look at World War II. A lot of what we know about genetics came from some of the biologists that were working for the Germans, and they committed these insanely inhumane acts. But the knowledge we got from it was several generations ahead of where we started. I don't particularly care for that method in the scientific progress, but she's a good example of why it works. And that wraps up the characters in the book for me. There weren't very many. I just talked about the main ones, and those were all characters whose points of view you did visit at some point in the book. Because I did talk quite extensively about the science and in terms of how much I liked it. Now that I'm moving on to my next section, it's the book club question section, where there are questions that are typically brought up in IRL book clubs. Instead of doing the 10 questions, I did weed it down to 4, just because, like I said, I talked about science a little more than I anticipated, so I'm not going to go through as many questions this month. So the first question 1, is the story plot-based or character-driven? This story is more character-driven. It uses diverse characters playing off of each other to march the story forward. And it does this by using multiple perspectives, the interactions between the characters, and these interactions are both direct and observed. So, and next question 2, was, how was the setting unique? Could it have taken place anywhere? Was the setting unique? No, not really. It took place in the UK. They talk about London a lot, and they talk about Beacon, which is a city-state that was created kind of at post-break, and that's where all the science-y stuff was going on. And zombie apocalypse have been done quite a bit, and I've read a number of them from different situations, some in North America, some like World War Z, which was the last book I reviewed, was kind of a worldwide experience. So no, it wasn't necessarily unique, and it could have happened anywhere, as with other books. Moving on to the next question 3. How did you feel about the ending? What did you like? What did you dislike? Would you change anything? I loved the ending. It was a very good reference to Pandora, just with how after Just Snow is kind of the only known adult left, and she has already had these interactions with Melanie, it makes her a very good teacher for the other students, and the other students are terrified of Melanie because of how she reacted and kind of took supremacy away from one of these other children. And also how it really emphasized the role switching of Helen Justineau and Melanie as the book progressed. Because as the book progressed, you found out that Melanie was more and more overpowered compared to Helen Justineau, although it seemed oppositely in the beginning. And I just really liked that role switch of Helen Justineau being the protector to Melanie becoming the protector, and then the role of the vulnerable party was also switched with that as well. I also really liked with the ending, the introduction of spores and the effects that it had on the environment and the effects that it had on the outcome for Helen Justineau. So she will end up teaching in these biohazard suits, and it's almost cyclical in how she started the book teaching students, and now she's ending the book teaching students, but just in these very different environments for very different reasons. And that takes us to the next question 4. Would you read another book by this author, or would you read this book again? And I would say yes to both of those. I thoroughly enjoyed M.R. Carey's writing, and I was engaged the entire time, all the way through the book. And because of this, I would definitely pick up another book written by him. And would I read this book again? Honestly, I would. Although the couple of twists that they had in the book as they were revealed, I didn't feel like the twists were so large that it'd be hard to go back and read the book. I'd read it again because I would want to see and examine all these little small clues and hints that were dropped early on in the book as to what was going to happen and what the outcome would be leading to the resolution and end of the story. With those 4 questions, that wraps up my book club question section. All right, and with that, my review is getting wrapped up here. It's time to kind of give you a rating and my final summary of the book. So with this book, like I said, I really enjoyed it. It used the characters really well. They were very dynamic and they moved the story forward very effectively. It was a good use of multi-perspective as well. It really drove the story forward and allowed for the characters to become fleshed out at a good pace. So there was constant development with very few plateaus, as new situations were constantly introduced with both the characters and with the geographical progression of the characters. I also really enjoyed mental orgasm that I got from the logical extrapolation of the science in this story. I went on at length about it earlier in the review, so I don't really need to go over it again, other than to say they picked a good fungus family for this. The other thing that was good about it is that it didn't try to over-explain what was going on. I tried to over-explain what's going on a bit with my review and my original kind of analysis of the science. It explained, but the book did a really good job because it explained enough for everything that was happening to make sense, but it didn't explain so much that it didn't allow for the suspension of disbelief to take over, which filled in the gaps of knowledge and allowed for the whole story overall to feel more believable in terms of this fungal infection. The only kind of negative I had mentioned earlier as well, was just the whole idea of Carolyn Caldwell talking about cordyceps as if it was a sentient being, and referring specifically to the fungus itself, not the hosts of the fungus. And while I understand that she sees it this way on purpose, she sees it as this nemesis of her, and she's trying to outthink it. It annoyed me the way she addressed the fungus in her mind, and how she, like I said, just the fact that she kind of referred to it as sentient. So that being said, like a very excellent book, well-written characters, good pacing all over. This book, The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, 5 out of 5 stars. Really enjoyed it, really recommend it to anybody who really enjoys that kind of post-apocalyptic thriller genre. Like I said, very well written, engaging all the way through. And that wraps it up for my second book club book of the month book, and I will see you guys at the beginning of March for the next book review. Bye!